The desert wind carried more than sand that morning. It carried the metallic scent of blood and the desperate whispers of dying men. Through the haze of heat and smoke, a figure barely 5 feet tall moved like a shadow between the scattered debris of what had once been Convoy Delta-Seven. Her name was Sofia Reyes, and at 23, she had already learned that the world measured worth in inches and pounds, never in the size of one's heart. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The explosion had torn through their convoy just after dawn, when the desert still held the cool kiss of night against its sun-baked skin. Sofia had been riding in the medical transport, her small hands steady as she organized supplies that seemed to dwarf her petite frame. The other soldiers had been placing bets on whether she'd make it through her first deployment. Tiny Reyes, they called her, not always with kindness. Better hope we don't need to carry her out. Now, as she crouched beside Sergeant Marcus Thompson, a man twice her weight bleeding into the unforgiving sand, those words felt like prophecy twisted into cruel irony. His leg was mangled beneath a twisted piece of metal, his breathing shallow and labored. To his right, Corporal Voss clutched his abdomen, his young face pale as morning clouds. Further out, nearly buried beneath the overturned Humvee, Private Elena Castro called weakly for help, her voice barely audible above the desert's eternal whisper. "Reyes," Thompson gasped, his eyes finding hers through the settling dust. "Radio's dead. GPS fried. He coughed, specks of blood staining his lips. "We're 12 miles from base camp." Sofia's fingers moved automatically to her medical pack, hands that had been ridiculed for their size, now working with precision that would have impressed her instructors back at Fort Sam Houston. She'd graduated top of her class from combat medic training, but her commanding officers had questioned whether someone of her stature belonged in an active combat zone. At 4 feet 11 inches and barely 110 pounds, she looked more like she belonged in a college library than a battlefield. "I know where we are," she said quietly, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised even her. The mountains to the east formed a familiar silhouette against the brightening sky. She'd studied these topographic maps until she could navigate them in her sleep, partly out of professional duty, but mostly because proving herself required knowing twice as much as everyone else. The morning sun climbed higher, transforming the desert into a furnace. Sofia moved between her wounded comrades with the efficiency of someone who had imagined this moment 1,000 times. She'd grown up in El Paso, where the desert wasn't an enemy, but a harsh teacher. Her grandmother, Esperanza, used to tell stories of her own youth, carrying water across miles of similar terrain during the drought of '43. "Mija," she would say, "the desert doesn't care how tall you are. It only cares how strong your spirit burns." Thompson's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The metal fragment had severed an artery, and despite Sofia's best efforts with pressure bandages and hemostatic agents, he was losing blood faster than his body could afford. Voss had shrapnel to his torso, several pieces that Sofia couldn't remove without proper surgical facilities. Castro's leg was trapped, but she seemed stable for now, conscious and alert despite her pain. "We need medevac," Voss whispered, his voice thin with shock. "How long until they come looking?" Sofia checked her watch. The convoy had been running silent, radio checks every 4 hours. They wouldn't be missed for another 2 hours at minimum. In this heat, with these injuries, that might as well be forever. She looked out across the endless expanse of sand and stone, calculating distances with the precision her training had drilled into her mind. The nearest road was 6 miles south, but it was rarely traveled. Base camp lay 12 miles northwest, but the route was treacherous, filled with loose sand and rocky outcroppings. There was, however, another option, a route she'd studied obsessively during their briefings. 2 miles due east lay an abandoned watchtower, and beyond that, a patrol route that saw regular traffic. If she could get them there. She said, "I'm going for help." already moving to fashion makeshift stretchers from vehicle debris and medical supplies. "No way in hell," Thompson managed, his voice strained but firm. "You can't carry us, Reyes. You're—" He paused, perhaps realizing how his words might sound. "Small?" finished Sofia, without bitterness. "Yes, Sergeant, I am. But I'm also the only one of us who can walk." She had started fashioning the first stretcher when Castro spoke up from beneath the Humvee. "Sofia, listen to me. I've done the math. Even if you could drag one of us, you'd collapse from heat exhaustion before you made it a mile. This is suicide." The words hung in the superheated air like a challenge. Sofia paused in her work, her hands steady on the straps she was weaving together. They were right, of course, from a purely logical standpoint. She weighed perhaps 60 pounds less than the lightest of them. The desert was already approaching temperatures that could kill a healthy person in hours. Every military manual would classify this as an impossible mission. But Sofia had spent her entire life being told what was impossible for someone her size. Too small for varsity basketball, despite her speed and precision. Too slight for the military, despite her perfect test scores. Too delicate for combat medicine, despite her steady hands and unshakable calm under pressure. She had built her life on proving the impossible wrong. "Maybe," she said quietly, continuing to work on the stretcher, "but the only other option is to watch you die while we wait for help that might not come in time." The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape that had swallowed armies and humbled empires. The Tohono O'odham people had crossed these lands for centuries, finding water in places that seemed lifeless, navigating by stars and subtle signs that escaped most modern eyes. Sofia's great-grandfather had been Tohono O'odham, and though she'd grown up far from the reservation, something in her blood recognized this place not as an enemy, but as a test. She worked through the morning heat, using every piece of medical knowledge and desert survival training she possessed. The stretchers she constructed were marvels of improvisation, lightweight but strong, designed to distribute weight across her small frame. She rationed their remaining water with mathematical precision, calculating survival times and hydration needs with the cold efficiency of someone who understood that emotion was a luxury they couldn't afford. As the sun reached its zenith, casting shadows sharp as knife blades, Sofia made her final preparations. She had torn her own uniform to create additional padding and straps. Her exposed skin was already beginning to burn, despite the sunscreen she'd applied. The route she'd chosen was the shortest distance to potential rescue, but it crossed some of the most challenging terrain in the region. "Reyes," Thompson called, as she made final adjustments to his stretcher. His voice was weaker now, but his eyes held something she'd never seen from him before. Respect. "Why? Why risk this for us? Half the unit. We haven't exactly been—" "Kind," Sofia supplied, checking the straps one final time. "Sergeant, I didn't join the army to make friends. I joined to serve. That means all of us come home regardless of what anyone thinks about my size." The honesty in her voice cut through the heat like a cool breeze. These men had questioned her place among them, had made jokes about her stature, and doubted her capabilities. But now, facing the possibility of dying in this forgotten corner of the desert, those differences seemed as insignificant as grains of sand. As Sofia positioned herself at the head of Thompson's stretcher, she felt the weight of more than just his body. She carried the expectations of everyone who had ever doubted her, the legacy of women who had fought for the right to serve in combat roles, and the hopes of every person who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. The desert waited, patient and pitiless, as Sofia Reyes, all 4 feet 11 inches of her, prepared to attempt something that would be remembered long after the sand had covered the wreckage of Convoy Delta-Seven. The first step was always the hardest,
But as her grandmother used to say, even the longest journey begins with the courage to move forward. Behind her, the convoy's remains slowly disappeared into the shimmering heat, leaving only footprints and furrows in the sand to mark the beginning of an impossible journey. The desert held its breath, waiting to see if heart could triumph over physics, if will could overcome the simple mathematics of size and distance.
This was her moment of truth, and Sofia Reyes stepped into it without hesitation, pulling 230 pounds of wounded soldier behind her into the vast, unforgiving beauty of the American Southwest. The sun beat down mercilessly, the sand shifted treacherously beneath her feet, and somewhere in the distance, help waited, if she was strong enough to reach it. Sofia's childhood had been measured in increments of inadequacy. At family gatherings in East El Paso, she was always the one lifted onto phone books to reach the dinner table, the one who needed help reaching items from high shelves, the one whose feet dangled from chairs like a child's well into her teenage years. But within the walls of the small adobe house she shared with her grandmother Esperanza, these limitations transformed into something else entirely: determination forged in the crucible of necessity. Every morning before school, Sofia would wake at 5 to help her grandmother prepare breakfast for the construction workers who rented rooms in their converted garage. Esperanza, herself barely 5 feet tall, had built a small empire of hospitality from nothing but grit and the recipes passed down through 4 generations of strong women. Sofia learned to flip eggs on a grill she had to stand on a milk crate to reach, to carry plates that seemed enormous in her small hands, to navigate a world built for people twice her size with the fluid efficiency of someone who refused to see obstacles as excuses. "Mija," Esperanza would say, watching Sofia struggle to carry a tray of coffee to the workers, "the desert doesn't ask the cactus how tall it wants to be. It grows strong in the space it's given." High school had been a series of battles fought on fields where size determined worth. When Sofia tried out for the basketball team, Coach Martinez looked her up and down with the expression of someone faced with a cruel joke. "Reyes, you're talented, no question, but talent doesn't add inches. You'd get crushed in league play." When she auditioned for the school's elite dance troupe, the instructor gently suggested she consider behind-the-scenes roles, where her petite stature wouldn't be a disadvantage. But Sofia had found her calling in the most unlikely place, the school's first aid station. During her junior year, a massive pileup had occurred during the homecoming football game, and Sofia had been the only person with medical training in the immediate vicinity. As she moved between injured players, some of them towering over her even while lying down, her size became irrelevant. Her hands could find pulse points that others missed, could navigate narrow spaces between bodies, could perform delicate procedures with steadiness that impressed the paramedics who arrived on scene. Reyes, EMT Rodriguez, had told her that night, "You've got natural instincts. Ever think about being a nurse?" Sofia had smiled politely, but something in her chest had rebelled against the assumption. Why a nurse? Why not a doctor? Why not a combat medic? Why did everyone's first instinct involve placing her in supporting roles, as if leadership were a privilege reserved for those above a certain height requirement? The decision to join the army had shocked everyone, including herself. During her senior year, as classmates planned college parties and worried about dormitory assignments, Sofia spent her evenings studying military regulations and physical fitness requirements. The minimum height requirement for women was 4 feet 10 inches. She barely made it at 4 feet 11, but barely was enough. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was a masterclass in creative problem-solving. The obstacle courses were designed for average-sized soldiers, which meant Sofia had to develop techniques that worked for her unique physical profile. While other recruits powered through rope climbs with brute strength, Sofia learned to use her low center of gravity and excellent strength-to-weight ratio to move up ropes like a dancer ascending silk.
When carrying wounded soldiers during medical training, she couldn't rely on lifting them. She had to master the art of leverage, using mechanical advantage and proper body positioning to move patients twice her size. Her drill sergeants had been skeptical at first. Sergeant First Class Williams made no secret of his doubts about tiny soldiers in a big war. But Sofia's test scores were perfect, her medical knowledge was encyclopedic, and her persistence was legendary among the training cadre. When other recruits struggled with heat injuries during summer training, Sofia, accustomed to desert conditions from her El Paso childhood, remained steady and alert. When precision was required for medical procedures, her small hands were assets rather than limitations. "Reyes," Sergeant Williams had said during her graduation ceremony, "I'll be honest, I thought you'd wash out in week 2. I was wrong. You're going to save lives out there."
Supplies that seemed proportionately massive but were perfectly manageable for her well-conditioned frame. But even as her skills developed, the whispers followed her from base to base. "Pocket medic," some called her. "Better hope she doesn't need her to carry you out," others joked. The comments weren't always malicious. Many came from a place of genuine concern for her safety, but they accumulated like desert sand, working their way into every confidence and polishing every doubt until they gleamed like stones. Her first deployment assignment to the Middle East had been met with raised eyebrows from commanding officers who questioned whether someone of her stature belonged in active combat zones. Captain Morrison had been diplomatic but direct during their initial briefing. "Reyes, your medical skills are exemplary, but in hostile territory, medics need to be able to evacuate wounded soldiers quickly. Can you honestly tell me you're capable of carrying a 200-pound man to safety?" Sofia had given the expected answer that she would work within her capabilities and rely on her team for support when necessary. But privately, she had spent countless hours training for exactly that scenario. She studied fireman carries, practiced drag techniques, learned to use stretchers and mechanical aids with maximum efficiency. She had turned her perceived weakness into the focus of relentless preparation. The other members of her unit had treated her with a mixture of protection and condescension that was somehow worse than outright hostility. They included her in conversations, but spoke to her like a younger sister rather than a peer. They praised her medical skills while simultaneously arranging themselves as her protectors, as if her competence existed within carefully maintained boundaries. Sergeant Thompson had been one of the more diplomatic ones. "Reyes, you're good at what you do," he'd said during a training exercise, "but out there, things get chaotic fast. We just want to make sure you're positioned where you can do the most good without putting yourself or us at unnecessary risk." The unspoken message was clear. Stay back, stay safe, let the bigger soldiers handle the dangerous work. But Sofia hadn't joined the army to stay safe. She'd joined to serve, to prove that courage and competence weren't measured in inches, to take her place alongside soldiers who might be taller but weren't necessarily braver. Her relationship with the desert had been forged in childhood summers spent with her great-uncle Miguel, who'd worked as a guide for oil survey teams in the 1970s. Miguel had been built like Sofia, compact and wiry, and he'd taught her to read the landscape like scripture. "The desert tells stories, mija," he'd say, pointing out the subtle signs that indicated water, weather, and direction. "But you have to be small enough to listen to its whispers." Those summers had taught her that survival in harsh environments wasn't about overpowering the landscape. It was about understanding it, working with it, finding the paths of least resistance that others might miss. While her fellow soldiers saw the desert as an enemy to be conquered, Sofia saw it as a puzzle to be solved, a test that favored intelligence and adaptation over brute strength. Now, as she prepared to put years of training and a lifetime of preparation to the ultimate test, Sofia felt the weight of every doubt that had ever been expressed about her capabilities. But she also felt the steady presence of every woman who had fought for the right to serve in combat roles, every person who had been underestimated and had chosen to prove their critics wrong through action rather than argument.
The stretcher straps bit into her shoulders as she positioned herself at the head of Thompson's makeshift gurney. Her hands, still steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, made final adjustments to ensure maximum efficiency in weight distribution. Around her the desert stretched infinite and indifferent, a landscape that would judge her not by her size, but by her endurance, not by others' expectations, but by her own will to continue when continuation seemed impossible. This was the moment she had been preparing for her entire life, even when she hadn't known it. Every lifted tray in her grandmother's kitchen, every obstacle course at Fort Leonard Wood, every night spent studying trauma medicine until her eyes burned. All of it had been leading to this point where size would matter less than heart, where the measure of a soldier would be taken not in inches, but in the distance she was willing to carry her brothers across an unforgiving land. The first mile was deception wrapped in false hope. Sofia's adrenaline carried her across the relatively flat terrain near the convoy wreckage, her small frame settling into a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. She pulled Thompson first, his makeshift stretcher sliding across the sand with less resistance than she had feared. The early morning air still held traces of coolness, and her muscles, conditioned by years of training, responded with the efficiency she'd drilled into them through countless hours of preparation.
But the desert was merely biding its time. By the 45-minute mark, the landscape began its subtle transformation into something more hostile. The flat expanse gave way to rolling dunes that required her to pull the stretcher uphill, each step sinking deeper into sand that seemed designed to swallow her boots. The straps cut into her shoulders with increasing intensity, redistributing Thompson's weight in ways that made her trapezius muscles burn with each forward movement. Her water consumption increased as her body worked harder to maintain core temperature, and she found herself calculating hydration rates with growing concern. "Stop," Thompson whispered, as Sofia paused at the crest of a particularly challenging dune. "You're killing yourself. Leave me and get help." Sofia adjusted her grip on the stretcher handles, her gloves already damp with perspiration despite the dry heat. "Not happening, Sergeant. We discussed this. That was before you started this insane march. Look at yourself, Reyes. You're already overheating, and we've barely started." It was true. Sofia could feel the early warning signs of heat stress: increased heart rate, slight dizziness when she moved too quickly, and the beginning edge of nausea that preceded heat exhaustion. But she also knew these symptoms were manageable if she paced herself correctly and maintained proper hydration discipline. The return trip for Voss proved even more challenging. The corporal had lost consciousness twice during her absence, his breathing shallow and rapid in a way that indicated shock was setting in. Sofia worked quickly to stabilize his condition, administering fluids and adjusting his position to improve circulation, but she knew his window for survival was narrowing with each passing hour. "Sofia, please," Voss managed, as she prepared his stretcher. "I heard Thompson trying to talk sense into you. This is suicide. You can't carry all three of us." "Watch me," she replied simply, though privately she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd attempted. The journey with Voss revealed the desert's true nature. What had seemed like manageable terrain with Thompson became a gauntlet of obstacles that tested every limit of her physical capability. The sand grew deeper and more treacherous, hiding rocks and depressions that threatened to turn her ankles or catch the stretcher runners. The sun climbed higher, transforming the air itself into a weight that pressed down on her with increasing intensity. Halfway through the second evacuation, Sofia encountered her first major crisis. A hidden wash, one of those deceptive desert features that appeared as merely another dune from a distance, opened up in front of her like a mouth in the earth. The depression was perhaps 15 feet deep and 30 feet across, filled with loose sand and scattered stones that would make descent treacherous and ascent with a wounded soldier nearly impossible. Sofia stared into the wash, calculating angles and considering alternatives. Going around would add at least half a mile to her route, time that Voss couldn't afford, but attempting to cross risked injuring both of them, potentially creating 2 casualties instead of 1. She chose to descend. The trip down was controlled chaos,
Sofia using her weight and the stretcher's momentum to slide down the sandy slope in a barely managed fall. Voss groaned as they hit the bottom, the impact jarring despite her efforts to cushion their landing. The climb out was an exercise in physics that would have impressed her high school science teacher, a series of carefully calculated movements that used every principle of leverage and mechanical advantage she could summon. 3 times, the stretcher slipped backwards as she climbed, forcing her to restart the ascent from the beginning. By the time she crested the opposite side of the wash, her uniform was soaked with perspiration, her hands were cramping from gripping the stretcher handles, and her legs trembled with fatigue that went beyond muscle tiredness into something approaching cellular exhaustion. "Jesus Christ, Reyes," Voss whispered, his voice filled with awe and horror in equal measure. "How are you still standing?" Sofia didn't answer because she wasn't sure she knew. Something beyond conscious will had taken over. A determination that seemed to come from a place deeper than thought. She was operating on instincts honed by generations of women who had carried impossible burdens across impossible distances, drawing strength from sources that military manuals didn't catalog.
The third evacuation, Private Castro, presented challenges that combined all the difficulties of the first 2 journeys with the added complication of Sofia's rapidly deteriorating physical condition. Her core temperature was elevated beyond safe ranges, her hydration was becoming critical despite careful water management, and her muscles were operating in deficit modes that would leave her sore for weeks if she survived this ordeal. Castro's leg injury made her transport particularly difficult. The makeshift splint Sofia had constructed was adequate for stabilization, but created awkward weight distribution that threw off her carrying technique. She had to modify her approach, using a combination of pulling and supporting that required her to move backwards for significant portions of the journey, navigating by compass heading and terrain features rather than direct visual confirmation of her route. It was during this final evacuation that the desert revealed its cruelest test. The wind began to pick up, starting as a gentle breeze that provided welcome cooling, but gradually intensifying into something more dangerous. The air filled with sand particles that stung exposed skin and made breathing increasingly difficult. Visibility dropped as the wind created localized dust devils that obscured landmarks and disoriented her navigation. Sofia found herself in the middle of what desert veterans called a haboob, not quite a full sandstorm, but a sustained wind event that could last for hours and turn familiar terrain into an alien landscape. The psychological impact was almost as challenging as the physical obstacles. The desert, which had felt vast but navigable, suddenly became a maze without walls, a puzzle whose pieces shifted with every gust of wind. "We're lost," Sofia said, her voice tight with pain and growing panic. "Sofia, we're completely lost." It would have been easy to agree, to succumb to the despair that whispered at the edges of her consciousness. The landmarks she'd been using for navigation were obscured by blowing sand. Her compass readings seemed inconsistent, and every direction looked identical through the haze of dust and heat shimmer. But Sofia closed her eyes and listened to the desert with senses her great-uncle Miguel had taught her to trust. The wind carried scents, creosote and sage from the northwest, the metallic tang of mineral deposits from the northeast. The ground beneath her feet had subtle variations in texture and slope that told stories about water flow and geological formation. Most importantly, the sun's position, even filtered through the dust, provided a constant reference point for direction. "We're not lost," she said, with confidence that surprised both of them. "The watchtower is 700 meters southeast. I can feel it." Castro would later say that Sofia's certainty in that moment was almost supernatural, as if she had tapped into some primordial connection with the landscape that transcended ordinary navigation. But Sofia knew the truth was both simpler and more complex. She had simply learned to listen to a language that most people never bothered to learn.
The final approach to the watchtower was a descent into something approaching hallucination. Sophia's body was operating beyond its normal parameters, burning reserves of energy and drawing on determination that seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. Her vision tunneled, her hearing became hypersensitive to certain sounds while filtering out others, and her sense of time became elastic in ways that made minutes feel like hours. She pulled Castro's stretcher up a final rise, her legs trembling with each step, her breathing labored despite her excellent cardiovascular conditioning. The watchtower appeared through the dust like a mirage resolving into reality, a concrete structure perhaps 30 feet tall, topped with communication equipment that gleamed in the filtered sunlight. But the tower was only the first waypoint. Sofia knew that the patrol road lay another quarter-mile beyond, and even then, there was no guarantee that help would arrive quickly enough to
save her 3 wounded comrades. She had succeeded in moving them across 2 miles of desert terrain, but the battle was far from over. As she prepared for the final push toward the patrol road, Sofia felt something she had never experienced before. A profound understanding of her own capabilities that went beyond physical strength or endurance. She had discovered that the human spirit, when properly motivated, could accomplish feats that defied rational calculation. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to continue forward despite fear, despite pain, despite the logical impossibility of success. The desert wind continued to blow, carrying sand and secrets in equal measure, as Sofia Reyes prepared to complete a journey that would redefine how she saw herself and how others would see her for the rest of her life. It was Castro who spoke the truth that none of them had fully processed during the desperate hours of evacuation. "Sofia, do you realize what you just did? You carried 3 people across the desert. You saved our lives." The words felt strange in the superheated air, too large for the moment somehow. Sofia had been so focused on the mechanical aspects of survival, navigation, hydration management, injury stabilization, that the broader implications of her actions hadn't fully registered. She had simply done what needed to be done, using every skill and drawing on every reserve of strength she possessed. "I did what any medic would do," she replied automatically, the response trained into her through years of military discipline that emphasized team accomplishment over individual recognition. "No," Thompson said, his voice stronger now that he was out of direct sunlight. "No, Reyes. What you did was, I've been in the Army 15 years. I've seen heroes and I've seen impossible rescues. But this," he gestured weakly at the desert they had crossed, "this was something else entirely." The sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the northwest interrupted their conversation, the rhythmic percussion growing stronger until it drowned out the desert wind. Sofia popped orange smoke to mark their position, her movements automatic, despite the fatigue that made every action feel like moving through thick liquid. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter that settled onto the hardpan near the watchtower carried more than just medical personnel. Captain Morrison, their commanding officer, had personally flown out to verify the impossible reports filtering back through military communications channels. As the helicopter's engines wound down, he approached the scene with an expression that cycled through disbelief, concern, and something approaching awe. "Reyes," he said, his voice barely audible over the settling aircraft, "tell me exactly what happened here." Sofia's report was clinical and precise, delivered in the flat tones that military training imposed on extraordinary circumstances. She recounted the convoy attack, the assessment of casualties, the decision to evacuate on foot, and the 2-mile journey across desert terrain. Her account included technical details about medical treatment administered, navigation methods employed, and resource management strategies that had enabled their survival. But as she spoke, Captain Morrison's expression changed in ways that Sofia was too exhausted to fully catalog at the time. She would later learn that her matter-of-fact recounting of events that defied normal human capability was having a profound impact on everyone who heard it.
The flight medics working to stabilize her 3 patients kept glancing at her with expressions of professional respect that transcended rank and hierarchy. "Medic Reyes," the senior flight medic said as they prepared to load Thompson into the helicopter. "I need to ask, how much do you weigh?" The question seemed bizarre given the circumstances, but Sofia answered truthfully. 110 pounds, Sergeant." "And you carried Sergeant Thompson, who weighs 230 across 2 miles of desert in this heat?" "I pulled him on a stretcher, Sergeant. I used proper biomechanics, and that's still impossible," the flight medic interrupted, not unkindly, but with the certainty of someone who understood the physics involved. "The energy expenditure alone should have killed you. Add the heat stress, the navigation challenges, the medical care you provided. What you did violates several laws of human physiology." As the helicopter lifted off with its cargo of wounded soldiers, Sofia found herself alone with Captain Morrison in the shadow of the watchtower. The desert had returned to its eternal silence, broken only by the fading sound of rotors and the whisper of wind across stone and sand.
"Reyes," Morrison said finally, "I owe you an apology. When you were assigned to my unit, I had concerns about whether someone of your physical profile belonged in a combat zone. I was wrong." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Sofia understood that Morrison was acknowledging not just the success of her rescue mission, but the broader implications of what she had accomplished. She had proven that courage and capability weren't functions of size or strength, that the measures traditionally used to evaluate military personnel were incomplete at best. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she replied, falling back on the familiar refuge of military protocol. "No, Medic Reyes, you were redefining what it means to do your job." The helicopter ride back to base camp provided Sofia with her first opportunity to fully process what she had accomplished. As the desert landscape scrolled past below, she could trace the route she had taken, 2 miles that had seemed infinite while she was crossing them, but now appeared as merely another stretch of terrain distinguished only by the faint tracks her passage had left in the sand. At the base medical facility, Sofia submitted to a thorough examination that revealed the toll her rescue mission had exacted. She was severely dehydrated despite her careful water management. Her core body temperature was elevated beyond safe ranges, and her muscles showed signs of stress that indicated she had operated at maximum capacity for extended periods. Yet she had suffered no permanent injury, no damage that wouldn't heal with rest and proper recovery. But the real revelation came in the hours that followed as word of her actions spread through the military communication network. The story of Tiny Reyes carrying 3 wounded soldiers across 2 miles of desert had begun to take on mythical proportions, passed from unit to unit with the kind of reverence typically reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, the base's commanding officer, arrived at the medical facility within hours of Sofia's return. Chen had built her career on understanding the capabilities and limitations of military personnel, and she approached Sofia's bedside with the analytical mind of someone trying to reconcile impossible reports with verifiable facts. "Medic Reyes," Chen said, settling into the chair beside Sofia's hospital bed. "I've been in the military for 22 years. I've seen extraordinary acts of courage, superhuman feats of endurance, and impossible rescues that defied every manual we've written. But what you accomplished today, it's going to change how we think about combat medical operations." Sofia shifted uncomfortably, still adjusting to the attention her actions were generating. "Ma'am, I appreciate the recognition, but I was simply applying my training to an emergency situation." "Your training?" Chen repeated, consulting the tablet in her hands. "Let's talk about your training, Medic Reyes.
You graduated top of your class from combat medic training. Your physical fitness scores exceed standards despite your size disadvantage. Your desert survival scores were perfect, but none of that training specifically prepared you to transport 3 casualties across hostile terrain single-handedly. Chen was right, of course. Military training provided frameworks and principles, but what Sofia had accomplished transcended standard operating procedures. She had improvised solutions that drew on knowledge from multiple disciplines: medical training, desert survival, engineering principles, and something less tangible that might be called intuitive understanding of human limitations and how to exceed them.
Ma'am, my grandmother used to say that training gives you tools, but crisis reveals what you're truly capable of accomplishing with those tools. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Chen replied. I'd like to hear more about how your background prepared you for what you accomplished today. Over the next hour, Sofia found herself recounting not just the technical details of the rescue, but the lifetime of experiences that had shaped her approach to seemingly impossible challenges. She spoke about growing up in a world built for people twice her size, about learning to see obstacles as puzzles rather than barriers, about the desert wisdom passed down through generations of her family. But the most revealing conversation came when Thompson, Voss, and Castro were stable enough to provide their own accounts of the rescue. Their testimonies, recorded for the official after-action report, painted a picture of Sofia's actions that transcended simple heroics and entered the realm of something approaching the supernatural. She moved like the desert was helping her, Castro reported, her voice still weak but clear. I know that sounds crazy, but she navigated in conditions where I couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. She found water sources I didn't even know existed. She seemed to understand the terrain in ways that GPS couldn't replicate. Thompson's account was more technical, but no less extraordinary. Medic Reyes demonstrated field medical capabilities under extreme stress that exceeded anything I've witnessed in 15 years of military service. She managed 3 critical patients simultaneously while conducting a 2-mile evacuation across hostile terrain. Her resource management was textbook perfect, her triage decisions were flawless, and her improvised equipment modifications were ingenious. Voss, perhaps because he was closest to Sofia's age and had spent the most time observing her work during their deployment, provided the most insightful analysis. Sofia didn't just save our lives, she redefined what's possible for a combat medic. The Army's been debating whether women belong in combat roles, whether smaller soldiers can perform the same duties as larger ones. Sofia just answered those questions definitively. The implications of their testimonies extended far beyond Sofia's individual performance. Military planners were already beginning to reconsider assumptions about physical requirements for combat roles, about the relationship between size and capability, about the value of adaptation and innovation over brute strength. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the chief flight surgeon who had supervised Sofia's medical evaluation, provided perhaps the most scientifically significant assessment. From a physiological standpoint, what Medic Reyes accomplished should have been impossible. The energy expenditure required to transport 3 casualties across 2 miles of desert terrain in extreme heat while providing continuous medical care exceeds the calculated capacity of someone her size by approximately 300%. Then, how did she do it? Chen asked. That's what we need to understand, Martinez replied. Her conditioning was excellent, but not superhuman. Her technique was efficient, but not magical. Yet, somehow, she accessed reserves of strength and endurance that our current understanding of human physiology suggests shouldn't exist. The medical analysis revealed several factors that had contributed to Sofia's success. Her low body mass actually provided advantages in heat management, allowing her to maintain core temperature more effectively than larger individuals might.
Her excellent strength-to-weight ratio made the physical demands more manageable. Her familiarity with desert conditions enabled superior navigation and resource management. But beyond these quantifiable factors lay something more elusive, a combination of determination, training, and intuitive understanding that created capabilities greater than the sum of their individual parts. Sofia had achieved what psychologists term flow state on a level rarely documented, accessing mental and physical resources that enabled performance beyond normal human parameters.
This isn't just about one soldier's heroic actions, General Hawkins noted in her preliminary assessment. This is about fundamental assumptions we've made regarding physical requirements for military service. Medic Reyes has demonstrated that innovation, training, and determination can overcome traditional limitations in ways we need to understand and replicate. The story had begun to spread beyond military channels, picked up by defense journalists and military bloggers who understood the significance of what Sofia had accomplished. The initial reports focused on the dramatic rescue itself, but deeper analysis began to explore the broader implications for military doctrine and gender integration in combat roles. But for Sofia, lying in the medical facility bed while receiving IV fluids and recovering from her ordeal, the attention felt surreal and overwhelming. She had acted on instinct and training, doing what seemed necessary in the moment without considering the broader implications. The idea that her actions might change military policy or inspire other soldiers felt too large to process. "How are you handling all this attention?" asked Chaplain Williams, who had come to check on her spiritual well-being as much as her physical recovery. "Honestly, Chaplain, it feels like they're talking about someone else. I just did what any soldier would do in that situation." "But that's the exact point, isn't it?" Williams replied gently. "You've shown that what any soldier would do encompasses far more than we previously understood. You've expanded our definition of what's possible." As night fell over the base, Sofia stared out the medical facility window at the desert that had tested and ultimately accepted her. The landscape that had seemed so hostile during the rescue now appeared peaceful, almost welcoming in the silver moonlight. She had faced her ultimate test and emerged not just victorious, but transformed, both in her own understanding of her capabilities and in how others perceived what someone her size could accomplish. The desert wind whispered through the window screens, carrying scents of sage and possibilities that stretched far beyond the immediate horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that courage and capability couldn't be measured in inches or pounds. But tonight, Sofia Reyes allowed herself to rest in the knowledge that she had rewritten the rules of what was possible. 6 months after the desert rescue, Sofia found herself standing before a congressional subcommittee on military affairs, her dress uniform bearing new decorations that felt heavier than the wounded soldiers she had carried across 2 miles of sand. The Bronze Star Medal with Naller caught the committee room's fluorescent light as she adjusted her position at the witness table, preparing to testify about combat readiness standards and the integration of women in military roles. "Sergeant Reyes," said Congresswoman Patricia Valdez, reading from prepared notes, "your actions in the Mojave have been studied extensively by military analysts, physiologists, and combat training specialists. What would you say to critics who argue that your rescue was an exception rather than proof that current physical standards should be modified?" Sofia had faced this question countless times in the months following her rescue, from journalists, military officials, and fellow soldiers who struggled to reconcile her achievements with traditional assumptions about combat capabilities. Her answer had evolved through repetition, but the core remained unchanged. "Ma'am, I believe the question itself reflects a misunderstanding of what military service requires. Physical strength is important, but it's only one component of combat effectiveness. Adaptability, technical knowledge, decision-making under pressure, and the ability to innovate solutions to unprecedented problems,
These capabilities matter just as much as how much weight you can lift or how fast you can run. The hearing was part of a broader policy review, triggered by Sofia's rescue and its implications for military recruitment and training standards. Her story had become a catalyst for examining whether traditional physical requirements truly predicted combat effectiveness, or whether they simply perpetuated historical biases that limited military talent pools.
But the real changes had begun much closer to home, in the training programs and deployment strategies that directly affected soldiers like herself. The Combat Medic Training Program at Fort Sam Houston had incorporated Sofia's improvised stretcher designs into their standard curriculum. Her navigation techniques under adverse conditions were now taught as part of desert survival training. Most significantly, the military had begun developing equipment and protocols specifically designed to leverage the advantages of smaller-statured personnel, rather than trying to compensate for perceived disadvantages. Major Elena Rodriguez, who had replaced Captain Morrison as Sofia's commanding officer, was leading these innovations from the ground up. Sergeant Reyes demonstrated that we've been thinking about physical requirements all wrong, Rodriguez explained to a group of visiting defense officials. Instead of asking whether smaller soldiers can do the same things as larger ones, we should be asking what unique capabilities they bring to military operations. The answer to that question had surprised even Sofia. Her success in the desert had led to assignments that utilized her specific skill set in ways that traditional military planning had never considered. She had participated in rescue operations in confined spaces where larger personnel couldn't operate effectively. Her ability to navigate in low-visibility conditions had made her valuable for reconnaissance missions in challenging terrain. Her medical skills, enhanced by hands that could perform precise procedures in cramped conditions, had proven invaluable in field surgery situations. But perhaps most importantly, Sofia had become a mentor for other soldiers who had faced similar doubts about their capabilities. The military had established a specialized training program that paired experienced personnel with new recruits who brought non-traditional strengths to military service. Sofia found herself working with soldiers who excelled in areas that standard fitness tests didn't measure: technical innovation, cultural navigation, linguistic capabilities, and psychological resilience. "Sergeant Reyes changed how I think about my own limitations," said Private Jennifer Kim, a computer specialist whose small stature had initially raised questions about her deployment readiness. "She showed me that what others see as disadvantages can become advantages if you develop the right strategies and maintain confidence in your capabilities." The ripple effects extended beyond individual soldiers to broader military culture. Units that had once focused primarily on physical dominance began emphasizing tactical innovation and adaptive problem-solving. Training exercises incorporated scenarios that required intellectual rather than purely physical solutions. Combat effectiveness evaluations began measuring creativity, persistence, and technical expertise alongside traditional metrics. Thompson, Voss, and Castro had become unlikely ambassadors for these changes, speaking at military academies and training facilities about their experience being rescued by someone whom traditional evaluation methods had underestimated. Their testimonies carried particular weight because they had been skeptics themselves before witnessing Sofia's capabilities firsthand. "I'll be honest," Thompson told a group of officer candidates at West Point. "When Sergeant Reyes was assigned to our unit, I had concerns about whether she could perform at the level combat operations demand. I was measuring her against criteria that I thought mattered most: size, strength, traditional indicators of battlefield capability. What I didn't understand was that I was using the wrong measuring stick entirely." The personal transformations were equally significant. Sofia had evolved from someone who constantly worked to prove herself worthy of acceptance to someone who understood that her worth had never been in question, only others' ability to recognize it.
The confidence she had gained from successfully completing an impossible mission radiated through every aspect of her military service and personal life. Her relationship with the desert had deepened into something approaching spiritual connection. She had returned to the rescue site several times, both for official documentation and personal reflection. Each visit revealed new details about the route she had taken, the decisions she had made, and the resources she had accessed during those crucial hours. The landscape that had tested her so severely had become a source of strength and perspective that informed her approach to new challenges. Esperanza, her grandmother, had lived to see Sofia's transformation from a young woman fighting to prove herself into a confident leader who had redefined what others thought possible. During Sofia's leave following the rescue, they had sat together on the porch of the small house in El Paso, watching the sunset paint the western mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "Mija," Esperanza had said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of prophecy fulfilled, "I always knew the desert would teach you its secrets, but I never imagined you would teach the desert and the world something new in return."
The official recognition had been important for institutional change, but the personal acknowledgement from fellow soldiers carried deeper meaning. Sofia's unit had developed traditions that honored her achievement while celebrating the broader principle it represented, that courage and capability couldn't be measured by conventional standards. They had established the Reyes standard, not a physical benchmark, but an approach to problem-solving that emphasized innovation, persistence, and the creative application of available resources. Soldiers throughout the military had begun adopting this mindset, looking for unconventional solutions to challenging problems rather than defaulting to traditional approaches that might not suit their individual strengths. The changes weren't without resistance. Some military traditionalists argued that lowering physical standards would compromise combat effectiveness. Others worried that Sofia's exceptional performance was being used to justify policy changes that weren't supported by broader evidence. These debates played out in military journals, congressional hearings, and officer training programs throughout the armed forces. But Sofia had learned to engage with these concerns constructively rather than defensively. She understood that lasting change required building consensus among people who might initially resist new approaches. Her testimony before various military and civilian authorities focused on demonstrating how expanded definitions of capability could strengthen rather than weaken military effectiveness. The goal isn't to lower standards, she had explained to a gathering of senior military leaders. The goal is to develop better standards, measurements that capture the full range of capabilities that modern military service requires. Physical fitness remains important, but it shouldn't be the only factor we consider when evaluating whether someone can serve effectively in combat roles. 2 years after the rescue, Sofia was selected to lead a new training initiative that combined traditional military instruction with innovative approaches to problem-solving and resource management. The training facility, established at Fort Carson in Colorado, became a laboratory for exploring human potential under extreme conditions. Sofia worked with physiologists, psychologists, and combat veterans to develop methods that enabled soldiers to access reserves of strength and endurance they didn't know they possessed. The techniques weren't mystical or supernatural. They were based on solid scientific principles about stress management, efficient movement, and optimal resource utilization. But underlying all the technical innovations was a fundamental shift in mindset that Sofia had discovered during her desert ordeal. Military service wasn't about conforming to a single standard of excellence. It was about developing your unique capabilities to their maximum potential and learning to apply them effectively in service of larger goals. The program's first graduation ceremony took place on a warm spring morning that reminded Sofia of that day in the desert when everything had changed. As she watched new soldiers receive certifications in advanced combat problem-solving, she felt the profound satisfaction of having helped others discover their own hidden capabilities. "Sergeant Reyes," said Colonel Michael Chang, the base commander, as the ceremony concluded, "when you carried those 3 soldiers across the desert, you probably thought you were just doing your job, but you were actually launching a revolution in how we think about human potential in military service." Sofia smiled, remembering her grandmother's words about the desert teaching lessons to those patient enough to listen. She had learned that true strength wasn't about overpowering obstacles, it was about finding creative ways to work with whatever resources were available, whether those resources were physical, mental, or spiritual. The desert wind that had challenged her that day continued to blow, carrying new stories of soldiers who had discovered their own unexpected capabilities, their own ways of exceeding limitations that others had assumed were permanent. Sofia Reyes had proven that courage couldn't be measured in inches, and that lesson was spreading far beyond the military bases where she served, inspiring anyone who had ever been told they were too small, too weak, or too different to achieve their dreams.
5 years later. The auditorium at the Women's Military Academy fell silent as Sofia approached the podium, her lieutenant's bars gleaming under the stage lights. Before her sat 200 female cadets, their faces reflecting the same mixture of determination and uncertainty that Sofia remembered from her own military beginnings. Some were tall and athletically built, others were compact like herself, but all carried the weight of proving themselves in institutions that had only recently opened their doors to women in combat roles. "When I joined the Army," Sofia began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned her credentials through action rather than rhetoric. "The most common question I heard was whether someone my size belonged in a combat zone. Today, I want to talk about why that was the wrong question entirely." The speech had evolved over the years, shaped by hundreds of similar presentations at military academies, congressional hearings, and leadership conferences. But the core message remained unchanged. That true strength came not from conforming to others' expectations, but from understanding and maximizing your unique capabilities. In the front row sat Cadet Maria Santos, a young woman from Phoenix whose application essays had specifically mentioned Sofia's influence on her decision to pursue military service. Santos stood barely 5 feet tall and had faced similar questions about her suitability for combat roles. During the Q&A session that followed Sofia's presentation, she raised her hand with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am, how do you respond when people suggest that your rescue was exceptional rather than proof that physical standards should be reconsidered? How do you deal with the pressure of representing all women in combat roles?" Sofia paused, recognizing the weight behind the question. She had carried that same burden for years, the sense that her individual performance would be generalized to judge the capabilities of all women, all smaller soldiers, all people who didn't fit traditional military profiles. "Cadet Santos, I've learned that the best way to represent others is to focus on being the best version of yourself. Excellence doesn't require you to be perfect or superhuman. It requires you to understand your strengths, acknowledge your limitations, and develop strategies that maximize your effectiveness within those parameters." The academy visit was part of Sofia's new role as Director of Adaptive Combat Training, a position created specifically to develop military personnel who brought non-traditional strengths to modern warfare. The program had expanded beyond her initial work with smaller statured soldiers to encompass anyone whose capabilities weren't fully captured by conventional evaluation methods. Her team included former athletes who excelled in endurance rather than power sports, technical specialists whose combat value lay in intellectual rather than physical dominance, and cultural experts whose understanding of local populations proved invaluable in modern military operations. Together, they had developed training protocols that emphasized adaptability, innovation, and strategic thinking alongside traditional military skills. But the program's most significant success stories came from soldiers who had initially been marginalized by conventional military culture. Lieutenant Jessica Chen, an Air Force pilot whose small stature had been considered a disadvantage until she demonstrated superior performance in confined cockpit environments. Staff Sergeant Roberto Martinez, whose expertise in urban navigation had proven invaluable during missions in densely populated areas. Captain Sarah Williams, whose background in social work had made her exceptionally effective at building relationships with civilian populations in conflict zones. "What we have discovered," Sofia explained to a gathering of NATO military planners, "is that modern warfare requires capabilities that traditional military training has historically undervalued. Cultural sensitivity, technical innovation, psychological resilience, and adaptive problem-solving often matter more than raw physical strength."
The statistical evidence supporting this conclusion had become overwhelming. Units that incorporated diverse physical profiles and skill sets consistently outperformed homogeneous groups in complex military scenarios. Problem-solving exercises that required innovation and adaptation favored soldiers who had learned to work around traditional limitations. Combat effectiveness evaluations increasingly showed that the most successful military personnel were those who could think creatively under pressure, rather than those who simply excelled at standardized physical tasks.
Initiative, a military-wide effort to optimize human resources by matching individual strengths to mission requirements rather than forcing all personnel into identical molds. The changes she had helped implement were no longer experimental programs but established military doctrine. Physical fitness remained important, but it was evaluated within the context of specific job requirements rather than applied universally. Technical skills, cultural knowledge, and psychological resilience received equal weight in personnel evaluations. Most significantly, the military had developed career tracks that leveraged diverse capabilities rather than penalizing soldiers who didn't fit traditional profiles. The desert rescue that had launched these changes had become case study material in military academies worldwide. But Sofia was most proud of the less dramatic transformations it had inspired. Thousands of soldiers who had discovered their own unique capabilities and learned to apply them effectively in service of larger goals. During a routine visit to Fort Sam Houston, Sofia encountered Sergeant Major Williams, her former drill instructor, who had initially doubted her suitability for military service. Williams, now responsible for implementing the adaptive training protocols Sofia had developed, greeted her with the broad smile of someone whose skepticism had been thoroughly overcome by evidence. "Colonel Reyes," Williams said, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition for teaching this old soldier that wisdom comes from questioning our assumptions rather than defending them." The conversation that followed revealed how profoundly military culture had shifted. Williams described training classes where soldiers learned to identify and develop their unique strengths, rather than struggling to meet uniform standards that might not suit their individual capabilities. He spoke about performance evaluations that measured creativity and adaptability alongside traditional metrics. Most importantly, he discussed a new generation of military leaders who understood that diversity of capability was a strategic advantage rather than a logistical challenge. "The kids coming through now," Williams observed, "they don't even question whether someone like you belongs in combat roles. To them, effectiveness is what matters, not conformity to some arbitrary physical profile." 15 years later, the documentary film Desert Angel, the Sofia Reyes story, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival to critical acclaim and audience enthusiasm that surprised even its producers. The film combined recreations of the rescue with contemporary interviews that explored its broader implications for military service and social assumptions about physical capability. But Sofia was most proud of the less dramatic transformations it had inspired. Thousands of soldiers who had discovered their own unique capabilities and learned to apply them effectively in service of larger goals. Dr. Angela Foster, a pediatric surgeon whose small hands had initially been seen as a disadvantage until she specialized in complex procedures requiring exceptional dexterity, spoke at the film's premiere about Sofia's broader influence. Sofia Reyes showed us that what others perceive as limitations can become advantages if we develop the right strategies and maintain confidence in our capabilities. Her story isn't just about military service, it's about recognizing and maximizing human potential in all its diverse forms. The medical applications of Sofia's insights had proven particularly significant. Hospitals had begun recruiting surgeons based on technical skill and precision rather than traditional physical profiles. Emergency medical services had developed protocols that optimized team composition based on individual capabilities rather than uniform standards. Medical schools had modified their admission criteria to emphasize problem-solving ability and innovative thinking alongside traditional academic metrics. 20 years later,
Sofia's retirement ceremony took place at the same desert location where she had rescued her 3 fellow soldiers 2 decades earlier. The abandoned watchtower had been converted into a monument commemorating not just her individual heroism, but the broader principle that courage and capability couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The guest list included generals and congressional leaders, but Sofia was most moved by the presence of hundreds of soldiers whose careers had been shaped by the opportunities her example had created. They represented every branch of the military and came from every demographic background, but they shared the common experience of having been underestimated by traditional evaluation methods until adaptive training protocols revealed their true capabilities. General Patricia Hawkins, now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, delivered the ceremony's keynote address. Colonel Reyes didn't just save 3 lives in the desert 20 years ago. She saved an institution from its own narrow assumptions about human capability. Today's military is stronger, more innovative, and more effective because Sofia taught us to value diversity of capability rather than conformity to artificial standards. But the moment that meant most to Sofia came when Esperanza's great-granddaughter, Isabella, approached the podium to read a letter from the family matriarch who had passed away the previous year. Esperanza's words, written in her distinctive handwriting despite her advanced age, captured the essence of what Sofia's journey had represented. "Mija, when you were small, I told you that the desert doesn't ask the cactus how tall it wants to be. It grows strong in the space it's given. You have shown the world that strength comes in many forms, that courage cannot be measured in inches, and that the human spirit can accomplish impossible things when it refuses to accept others' definitions of what is possible." As the ceremony concluded and guests dispersed across the desert landscape, Sofia remained at the monument, watching the sun set over terrain that had tested and ultimately transformed her understanding of her own capabilities. The desert wind carried the same whispers it had 20 years earlier, but now they spoke of possibilities rather than limitations, of potential rather than constraints. 25 years later, the Sofia Reyes Institute for Adaptive Leadership had become one of the world's premier research facilities for optimizing human performance across diverse populations and challenging environments. Located in El Paso, near the neighborhoods where Sofia had grown up, the institute brought together psychologists, physiologists, engineers, and military experts to develop methods that enabled people to exceed traditional limitations. Dr. Sofia Reyes Chen, she had married Dr. James Chen, a former Air Force physician 8 years earlier, served the institute's director while maintaining her military reserve status. The facility's research had applications far beyond military service. Corporate leadership development, athletic training, emergency response protocols, and educational methodologies all benefited from insights about adaptive capability and innovative problem-solving. The Institute's most successful program paired experienced professionals with newcomers who brought non-traditional backgrounds to various fields. The mentorship model Sofia had developed in the military had proven equally effective in civilian contexts, helping people identify and develop their unique strengths rather than struggling to conform to inappropriate standards. On the anniversary of her desert rescue, Sofia made her annual pilgrimage to the monument that marked the site of her transformation. The ceremony had grown into a celebration that attracted visitors from around the world, military personnel, students, business leaders, and individuals who had been inspired by her example to pursue their own seemingly impossible goals. This year's gathering included a surprise guest, astronaut Commander Lisa Park, whose small stature had initially disqualified her from space missions until Sofia's advocacy helped change NASA's physical requirements. Park's successful command of the International Space Station had validated the principle that capability couldn't be predetermined by conventional physical measurements.
Colonel Reyes showed us that the most important measurements of human capability are the ones we can't quantify with rulers or scales, Park said during her address to the assembled crowd. Determination, innovation, adaptability, and courage, These qualities determine what we can accomplish far more than our height or weight. 30 years later. The military academy that now bores Sofia's name graduated its first class on a warm spring morning that reminded longtime observers of that day in the desert when a small woman had redefined what was possible for human achievement under extreme conditions. The academy specialized in developing leaders who could maximize diverse capabilities rather than enforcing uniform standards, and its graduates were sought after by military and civilian organizations worldwide. Sofia, now in her early 50s and serving as the Academy's chancellor, watched the graduation ceremony with profound satisfaction. The young men and women receiving their commissions represented every possible physical profile and came from backgrounds that would have been considered unconventional for military leadership just 3 decades earlier. But they shared common characteristics that had nothing to do with size or traditional physical capability. Intellectual curiosity, adaptive thinking, emotional resilience, and commitment to maximizing their own potential while helping others do the same. These were the qualities that modern military service required, and they were the qualities that Sofia's life and career had demonstrated could overcome any limitation imposed by others' narrow assumptions. The graduation speaker was General Maria Santos, the former cadet who had questioned Sofia about representation and pressure 30 years earlier. Santos had built a distinguished career in military intelligence, leveraging her cultural background and linguistic capabilities to become one of the Army's most effective strategic advisors. "When I was a cadet," Santos told the graduating class, "I asked Chancellor Reyes how to deal with the pressure of representing all women in combat roles. She taught me that the best way to represent others is to focus on being the best version of yourself. Today, I want to pass that same wisdom to all of you. Excellence doesn't require you to be superhuman. It requires you to understand your strengths and develop strategies that maximize your effectiveness." As the ceremony concluded and new officers dispersed to their assignments around the world, Sofia reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small house in El Paso to this moment of institutional transformation. The desert wind that had challenged her so severely 30 years earlier now felt like an old friend, carrying stories of countless individuals who had discovered their own unexpected capabilities. The monument at the rescue site had become a pilgrimage destination for people facing their own seemingly impossible challenges. The inscription, carved in stone that would endure long after those who remembered Sofia's original deed had passed away, captured the essence of what she had learned during those crucial hours in the desert. Courage cannot be measured in inches. Strength comes in many forms. The human spirit can accomplish impossible things when it refuses to accept others' definitions of what is possible. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy lay not in monuments or institutions, but in the thousands of individuals whose lives had been changed by Sofia's example. They served in military units around the world, led civilian organizations, taught in classrooms, and pursued dreams that others had once dismissed as unrealistic. Each of them carried forward the principle that Sofia had discovered during her desert ordeal, that true strength came not from conforming to others' expectations, but from understanding and maximizing your unique capabilities in service of goals larger than yourself. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the academy grounds, a landscape that continued to test and teach anyone brave enough to listen to its whispers. But now those whispers spoke of possibilities rather than limitations, of potential rather than constraints, of a world where courage and capability were measured not by external standards, but by the willingness to exceed whatever boundaries others might attempt to impose.
Sofia Reyes had proven that size didn't determine strength, that conventional wisdom could be challenged and changed, and that the most important battles were often fought not against external enemies, but against the limitations that society placed on human potential. Her legacy lived on in every person who had ever been underestimated and chose to prove their critics wrong through action rather than argument. As the sun set over the New Mexico desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to stretch forever, Sofia felt the profound satisfaction of having used her life to expand what others believed was possible. The journey that had begun with a small woman carrying wounded soldiers across impossible terrain had grown into a movement that touched lives around the world. The desert wind continued to blow, carrying new stories of courage and capability, new examples of individuals who refused to accept artificial limitations, new proof that the human spirit could accomplish extraordinary things when it was guided by purpose rather than constrained by others' narrow assumptions about what was possible. And somewhere in that wind, Sofia could hear the echo of her grandmother's voice, speaking words of wisdom that had guided her through the most challenging moments of her life. Mija, the desert doesn't ask the cactus how tall it wants to be. It grows strong in the space it's given. Sofia Reyes had grown strong in the space she was given, and in doing so, she had expanded that space for countless others who would follow in her footsteps across the endless, possibility-filled landscape of human potential. 40 years later. The centennial celebration of the Women's Military Academy brought together alumni from around the globe, their diverse faces reflecting the profound changes that had transformed military service in the decades since Sofia's rescue. Dr. Sofia Reyes Chen, now recognized as one of the most influential military reformers of the 21st century, sat in the place of honor as thousands of graduates paid tribute to the principles she had helped establish. The keynote speaker was Admiral Jennifer Rodriguez, the first female Joint Chiefs Chairman, whose grandmother had been one of Sofia's early protégés. Rodriguez's address focused on the evolution of military effectiveness measurements and how Sofia's example had catalyzed a global reassessment of human potential. 40 years ago, Rodriguez told the assembled crowd, a small woman proved that courage couldn't be measured in inches, by carrying 3 wounded soldiers across impossible terrain. That single act of heroism became the foundation for a revolution in how we understand human potential. Today's military is more effective, more innovative, and more representative because Sofia Reyes taught us to value the full spectrum of human capability. The Academy's museum had become a pilgrimage site for military historians and leadership scholars from around the world. The centerpiece exhibit recreated Sofia's desert rescue with interactive displays that allowed visitors to experience the challenges she had faced and understand the innovations she had developed. But the most powerful element was the wall of inspiration. Thousands of photographs and stories from individuals whose careers had been shaped by Sofia's example. Among them was the story of Captain David Kim, whose childhood polio had left him with limited mobility until adaptive equipment designs pioneered by Sofia's Institute enabled him to serve as one of the Army's most effective intelligence analysts. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, whose expertise in cultural anthropology had proven invaluable in peacekeeping operations, credited Sofia's advocacy for creating opportunities for non-traditional military specialists. The institute Sofia had founded had expanded into a global network of research facilities studying human potential under extreme conditions. Their discoveries had applications far beyond military service. Disaster response protocols, space exploration programs, medical procedures, and educational methodologies all benefited from insights about adaptive capability and innovative problem solving. Dr. James Chen, Sofia's husband of 32 years, had become one of the world's leading experts on stress physiology and human performance optimization.
His research had validated many of the techniques Sofia had developed intuitively during her desert ordeal, providing scientific foundation for training methods that enabled people to access reserves of strength and endurance they didn't know they possessed. What Sofia discovered through necessity, Dr. Chen explained to a gathering of international researchers, was that human beings are capable of far more than our conventional measurements suggest. The key is developing methods that enable individuals to access their full potential rather than constraining them within artificial limitations.
The research had produced remarkable results across multiple disciplines. Olympic training programs now incorporated adaptive techniques that helped athletes overcome physical disadvantages through strategic innovation. Emergency response teams used protocols developed from Sofia's desert experience to optimize rescue operations in challenging environments. Corporate leadership programs taught executives to identify and leverage diverse capabilities within their organizations rather than expecting uniform performance standards. But perhaps the most significant impact was in education, where Sofia's principles had revolutionized approaches to student assessment and development. Schools around the world had abandoned one-size-fits-all evaluation methods in favor of systems that identified individual strengths and created customized development paths. The results had been extraordinary. Students previously labeled as below average were discovering exceptional capabilities in areas that traditional testing had never measured. 50 years later, the golden anniversary of Sofia's desert rescue was marked by a global celebration that transcended military circles to embrace anyone who had been inspired by her example to exceed their perceived limitations. The event, held simultaneously in a dozen countries, featured testimonials from individuals whose lives had been transformed by the principle that capability couldn't be predetermined by conventional standards. Sofia, now 83 and moving with the careful grace of someone whose body bore the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades, served as the honorary chairwoman for the celebration. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with the comfortable creases of someone who had lived fully and purposefully, but her eyes retained the same determined spark that had carried her across 2 miles of desert half a century earlier. The commemoration's most moving moment came when a group of current military personnel recreated Sofia's rescue route, carrying modern equipment that demonstrated how her innovations had been incorporated into standard military doctrine. The 3 volunteers who played the roles of Thompson, Voss, and Castro were themselves testament to the changes Sofia had inspired. A diverse group that included a female Navy SEAL, a Marine intelligence specialist with cerebral palsy, and an Air Force pilot whose compact stature had made him ideal for fighter cockpit operations. 50 years ago, said General Patricia Santos, Maria Santos's daughter, following her mother's military tradition, one small woman redefined what was possible for human achievement under impossible conditions. Today, millions of people around the world live fuller, more productive lives because Sofia Reyes proved that courage and capability cannot be measured by external standards. The celebration featured a documentary retrospective that traced the evolution of military policy, educational methodology, and social attitudes about human potential over the 5 decades since Sofia's rescue. Interviews with world leaders, scientists, educators, and ordinary citizens revealed the profound impact her example had on global understanding of human capability. President Elena Martinez, herself a former military officer who had benefited from the opportunities Sofia's advocacy had created, issued a proclamation declaring the anniversary a national day of recognition for adaptive leadership and the celebration of diverse human potential. Similar proclamations were issued by leaders throughout the world, acknowledging Sofia's contribution to expanding opportunities for millions of people who had been constrained by others' narrow assumptions about their capabilities. But for Sofia, the most meaningful recognition came from the handwritten letters that continued to arrive from individuals whose lives had been touched by her story. Teachers who had learned to recognize different forms of intelligence in their students, athletes who had overcome physical disadvantages through innovative training methods, business leaders who had built successful organizations by leveraging diverse capabilities rather than enforcing uniform standards.
One letter, from a young girl in Bangladesh whose small stature had initially prevented her from attending school until Sofia's foundation intervened with adaptive educational programs, captured the essence of what the rescue had come to represent. Dear Miss Sofia, my teacher told me about how you carried soldiers across the desert even though people said you were too small. Now I know that being small doesn't mean being weak.
And that being different doesn't mean being wrong. Thank you for showing me that I can be strong in my own way. The final chapter. At 91, Sofia returned one last time to the desert monument that marked the site of her transformation. The landscape had changed little in the 68 years since that morning when Convoy Delta-Seven had been destroyed and she had faced the choice between accepting defeat or attempting the impossible. The watchtower still stood, now reinforced and expanded into a visitor center that attracted pilgrims from around the world. She was accompanied by her great-granddaughter, Elena, a young woman who had inherited Sofia's compact stature along with her determination to exceed others' expectations. Elena was preparing for her own military service, following a family tradition that had been established by Sofia's example and continued through 3 generations of women who understood that strength came in many forms. Abuela, Elena said as they stood in the shade of the memorial, tell me again about that day. What were you thinking when you decided to try something everyone said was impossible? Sofia smiled, remembering the countless times she had answered similar questions over the decades. But this time, speaking to her own descendant in the place where her legend had begun, the answer felt different, more personal, more intimate, more true to the actual experience than the polished responses she had given to journalists and historians. Mija, I wasn't thinking about making history or changing the world. I was thinking about 3 men who were going to die if I didn't find a way to get them to safety. Everything else, the size difference, the distance, the heat, the impossibility of it all, those were just problems to be solved, not reasons to give up. But how did you know you could do it? I didn't know. That's the secret nobody wants to hear. I had no idea whether I could succeed, but I knew that not trying would guarantee failure, and trying gave us at least a chance for success. Sometimes courage isn't about being confident in your ability to succeed. Sometimes it's about being willing to attempt something important, even when you're not sure you can accomplish it. The monument stood silent in the starlight, its inscription visible even in the darkness. Courage cannot be measured in inches. Strength comes in many forms. The human spirit can accomplish impossible things when it refuses to accept others' definitions of what is possible. And in the distance, carried on the eternal desert wind, came the faint sound of footsteps. New generations of dreamers and achievers, following paths that Sofia Reyes had blazed by proving that the only true limitations were the ones we imposed on ourselves. In the end, Sofia's greatest rescue hadn't been pulling those 3 soldiers from the desert. It had been rescuing human potential itself from the narrow assumptions that had constrained it for too long, opening possibilities that would continue expanding long after the wind had erased her footprints from the sand. Subscribe to Stories of Courage, where silence is never forgotten.